My name is Jenah and I'm a senior here. Today I would like to talk about the effects of language on perception of reality. I'd like to start this talk out with just a question to you all. How many of you speak 2 or more languages? Just raise your hand. Wow. How many of you speak 3 or more? 4 or more? Maybe 5 or more? Okay, that was off script, I had to go further. That's really impressive. This talk might be of special interest to those of you who have raised your hands, and I'm really interested to see your side of the subject after this talk. Now, I had a lot of trouble deciding on my question. I want to study language in college. Specifically, I want to study cognitive and linguistic sciences, which is basically how language acquisition works, language comprehension, etc., etc. So I knew I wanted my big question to have a language focus. But it wasn't until I started looking for my novel that I really saw what I wanted to research. I read a book titled Babel 17. The basic premise of this book is that alien invaders are attacking the Alliance, communicating using a strange language called Babel 17. The main character, Roger Long, is a poet and linguist who works for the Alliance as a pilot. As she learns more and more of this language, Babel 17 seems to take over her, and it bends her reality so thoroughly that the Alliance actually becomes the enemy and she becomes a traitor to her own cause. It's actually a really good book, I recommend it. This idea that thought is determined by language was dubbed the Worfian hypothesis after the man who proposed it. So this is my question. Is thought determined by language? And if so, how does each language determine reality? I mean, that would be pretty cool, right? You could just learn another language, and then you see the world completely differently. I mean, it would make me learning French much more worthwhile. Unfortunately, my research came to a very sudden stop, as I quickly learned that a series of studies in the 70s, conducted by experts in the linguistics field, disproved this hypothesis. This study is more recent, from 2001, but it illustrates a lot of what was wrong with the strong Wolffian view. This study worked with color perception. Now, color is continuous. It's just a spectrum. It isn't broken up into segments. But language makes it this way. Blue and red, white and black, yellow and green. These are all ways we break color up into segments. So there's kind of a chicken and egg problem going here. Is this system of understanding color a cognitive process that's present in humans from infancy? Or is it something that is learned through language? It is accepted fact that if you take 3 color points, say A1, A2, and B, which are equal on the color spectrum, they're equidistant. But B is in a different category than A1. In this case, the difference between blue and green. B is much easier to distinguish as a different color than A and 1. Therefore, you could tell A1 from B easier than you could tell A1 and A2. In this study, researchers took 2 groups of 4-year-olds. One group spoke English, and the other group spoke the language of the Himba people. Now, the Himba people are from a very rural area of Namibia, and their language actually only contains 5 terms for describing color. The toddlers in each group were asked to identify the colors A1, A2, and B. If color categorization is inherent in humans, both groups of toddlers should easily be able to distinguish between A2 and B, but not between A1 and A2. Likewise, if categories are created by vocabulary and language, the group of English-speaking toddlers should be able to identify A1 and A2 more accurately. So, does a larger vocabulary of color terminology affect color perception? The answer is no, as both Himba and English-speaking toddlers show the same level of perception, regardless of language. At this point, I was somewhat discouraged, and I thought I might have to find a new question, because this one seemed to be a dead end. But as I dug a little deeper, I found that while the strong Worfian view was discredited, a weaker version was still a point of contention in linguistic communities. I found 3 pieces of evidence that point to linguistic influence on cognition. The first is through neurology, the second through grammar and form, and the third through big structural ideas that we use to visualize concepts that we cannot see. So let's look at those. From a neurological perspective, two languages do not always work the same way in the brain. Scientists were testing second language acquisition when they noticed that reading in a second language stimulates the fusiform gyrus area of the brain, which you can see here. They could use that activity to predict the competency of the subject's literacy in the second language. However, the activity in the fusiform gyrus does not predict the competency of the reading in the native language. This indicates that a second language uses different neural pathways and cognitive skills than the native language. Therefore, language does dictate some cognitive function at low levels, as it takes different neurological functions to work. Okay, so moving on from neurology, let's work with the more traditional linguistic side of things. I completely agree that the Whorfian view is incorrect. After all, physical things would still exist even without the presence of language. Rocks and trees and species of animals were all around before anyone uttered a word. But what about the non-physical? Abstract concepts like love and innocence and evil and socialism and stuff like that. We can't go over and feel these things or observe them under a microscope. The way we talk about things creates them in reality. Therefore, the methods with which we speak are very important, namely grammar and form. Christopher Betta wrote a book in 2005 titled Language of Meaning, The Structural Creation of Reality. The basic argument that underlies the whole book is that form creates meaning. As you can see here, that form, this is in French, I apologize, creates meaning. If we're to extend Betta's logic in abstract things, form dictates meaning, which in turn dictates reality. This idea is supported through the analysis of the passive voice. You guys all know what the passive voice is, right? It's like when you write spoken word and then it has a little squiggle underneath it and it says passive voice, consider revising. An example would be, John was hit by Bill. That's the passive voice. Compared to, Bill hit John. And that's the active voice. That's typically what you want to write in. These sentences are not synonymous, although they may seem to be at first glance. In the passive, there is the expression of a new state on the subject, in this case Bill, as a result of the preceding action. You have a different idea of Bill because of this action state format. When applied to abstract concepts, these small differences actually affect our perception of their reality. Okay, now on to the third point. Another question for you, and this one's a bit trickier. When you visualize time, like in a timeline, do you think of it horizontally, like in example A, or do you think of it vertically, like in example B? Can you just raise your hands for A, horizontally? B, vertically? That's actually very interesting. Personally, I view time horizontally, and there's actually a reason for this. Did you know that many Chinese people view time vertically? A study was performed in which this difference was explained due to language. Have you noticed that many of the words in English that are used to describe time are horizontal words, like before and after, or upstream and downstream? There are better times ahead of us, and then put the past behind you. These are all horizontal words. And it's the same in Mandarin, but it's the opposite. They use up and down words. There are some examples on the screen. I won't read Mandarin to you, but don't think that'd be very good. You can notice that the word that they use for climbing, and the word that they use for descent, is also used to show the relativity of months in time. And this isn't just when those people are speaking Mandarin. Even if they learn English, each person will have some sort of bias. Here's a graph that shows someone's vertical bias in regards to the age at which they learn English. As you can see, those children who learn English later have more vertical bias, showing how ingrained these ideas are, ingrained by language. Let's compare this study to the color one we looked at earlier. Putting the two together, we can conclude that some ideas, like color categorization, are inherent in human beings, while others, like the visualization of time, are instilled by language. We also know that different languages work differently neurologically, and that form dictates meaning. But you all speak multiple languages. I saw your hands, and you know that there's more to this. This wasn't part of my formal research. But I want to bring up some other questions that really do affect how we think of language. So what are the political, historical, cultural, and personal connotations behind a language? Maybe you only speak Hindi to your parents and speak English with your friends. How does that affect how you feel about the language? Does speaking Tibetan feel differently than speaking Hindi or Nepali because of the political influence behind it? These are just a few questions to consider as you speak your own language and how it might affect how you view yourself or your world around you. So let's see. Language can affect us, 1, neurologically, 2, through grammar and form, and finally 3, through big structural ideas. Though thought may not be determined by language, it is certainly influenced by it. Thank you.
I don't know if this will be too big to answer, but I'm just wondering, in a multilingual community like Woodstock or in India or something like that, we have this implication of language shaping perception of reality. How do you think that might affect the communities that are multilingual? Or do you think it has an effect? Or, I don't know, this might be too big.
Well, we do have to acknowledge the fact that this isn't a strong Morphean argument, and so language, while it affects us in small ways, won't actually literally change how we see the world. So you might not see very big differences between your friend who speaks Korean and your friend who speaks Hindi, but at the same time, the cultural and neurological effects may have some small difference. I don't know if it would be something that we can measure in a big, large scale, but personally, I think it would definitely have an influence.
I had a question about, in your research, did you come across anything to do with code switching? So, particularly in India right now, it's very common for people to grow up in homes where they don't really speak what we would consider Hindi traditionally, but they don't really speak what we would consider English traditionally either. It's a mix. Have you come across anything in your research about people whose native language is kind of a mix to begin with?
I did read something about it. I will admit I didn't read it that closely. I was going through my articles, I saw stuff about code switching, especially about conceptualization of reality. But I could forward you the research if you wanted, but I don't have it on my brain right now.
Do we have any questions from the audience? All right, thank you very much, Jenah. What would you? Yeah, go ahead, Jenah.
I guess my question is, if you come across anything in the research, you were talking about language constructing our notion of reality, and anything about the reverse. A group of people who migrate and go to a different region, and suddenly their language changes.
That's actually very interesting. Obviously, it would have to incorporate new things about vocabulary and new concepts. Like, say you lived in a desert earlier, and now you live in a place where there's a lot of water. You'd have to incorporate concepts like rivers and rain and stuff like that. I didn't personally come across in my research, but that's a very interesting question to bring up.
Any other questions?
More.
I'm sorry you're getting so many questions. So I'm interested if you came across anything about globalization and endangered languages and how any cultural implications or implications for humans as a whole as inhabitants of the same planet as we develop sort of more lingua franca and maybe lose like all of these languages that are only spoken by a few communities with small people. Not small people, but small numbers of people.
Well, obviously that's a very big issue today with globalization of languages and cultures becoming smaller and less prevalent to their people. We could take the example of the Himba people, which I talked about earlier. They're a very small, very rural group, and as globalization is happening, they are just adopting more and more language terms. One of the problems that the researchers actually faced when they were doing the research is that they couldn't show the difference between a lot of color categories because the adults in the Himba community had adopted words to compensate for that. So I believe what they eventually decided to do was to show the difference between blue and purple. Because there was no word, they hadn't adopted any word for purple. So it was just whatever the Himba language had for it. So while I didn't encounter anything about endangered languages specifically affecting this. Those are some examples and how globalization is impacting those languages.
Any other questions? All right, thank you very much.